You've destroyed everything we built and now you'll face the consequences. Brianna flinched. Just a small movement, barely noticeable, but I caught it. She was standing by the kitchen sink, hands gripping the edge like she needed the support. The overhead light buzzed, casting a dull yellow glow over the countertops. I waited. Let the weight of my words settle. She swallowed. Victor, don't. I kept my voice steady. Not angry, not desperate, just final. You don't get to explain. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic outside. Coldwater wasn't a big city, but it had its noise, sirens, the occasional street racer tearing down Main. Inside, though, it was just us, the smell of stale coffee and the undeniable truth hanging in the air like cigarette smoke. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, a nervous habit. I didn't mean it. Spare me. I pulled out a chair, sat down, elbows on the worn wooden table. The same table we'd picked out together 10 years ago. It had scratches, dents, history. How long? Brianna's gaze dropped to the floor. She was dressed in scrubs, soft blue, the kind she always wore after a shift at St. Mary's. She probably thought they made her look innocent, like the same woman who used to come home exhausted but happy, telling me stories about the patients she helped. But I wasn't buying it. She exhaled through her nose. A few months. A few months. I nodded, looking past her to the window over the sink. Outside, the neighbor's porch light flickered. Jacob Hudson, I said, and her whole body tensed. That was confirmation enough. Wealthy. Generous. Probably says all the right things. I leaned forward. Tell me something, Brianna. When you sat at our dinner table, when you kissed me goodnight, did you feel guilty? Or did you just tell yourself you deserved this? Her hands tightened around the dish towel. She didn't answer. I pushed my chair back and stood. I already know anyway. I grabbed the envelope from the counter, the one I'd put together after stopping by Maggie's coffee shop 3 days ago. Brianna's little morning routine had been the first thread to pull. She never used to linger at cafes, never used to check her phone like a damn teenager. Maggie had noticed. Maggie, who remembered every regular's order, had seen the same man sitting across from Brianna more times than coincidence allowed. A man with expensive taste, a custom-tailored suit, and an easy smile. Inside the envelope, hotel receipts, text message screenshots, a photo of them at Hudson's downtown club. All the proof I needed. I dropped it on the table. She didn't reach for it. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. I never wanted to hurt you. I laughed. A short, dry sound. Yeah? That's what they all say. Silence stretched between us. Outside, a car door slammed. Somebody shouted down the street. Normal life kept moving while mine hit a brick wall. I should have been furious. The kind of anger that makes a man throw punches, break things, make mistakes. But I wasn't. I was cold. Clear. My heart beat steady. This wasn't the first time I'd dealt with betrayal. Just the first time it had come from my own home. Brianna finally looked up at me, something desperate in her expression. Victor, I don't care why. I cut her off. I don't care what you felt or what excuse you have lined up. What matters is what happens next. She straightened, bracing for it. What do you mean? I stepped closer, my voice low. I mean, you don't get to walk away from this like nothing happened. You don't get to pretend this was a mistake and hope I forgive you. I nodded at the envelope. That's just the beginning. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. What are you going to do? I didn't answer. Let the silence say it for me. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there with the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The night air was sharp against my face. I took a deep breath, shoving my hands into my coat pockets. Down the street, headlights swung into view. Right on time. Liam Evans's beat-up taxi rolled to a stop at the curb, the engine coughing like a pack-a-day smoker. The window slid down and Liam's scruffy face appeared, lit by the dim glow of the dashboard. He smirked. So, how'd it go? You burned the place down or just torch her with words? I yanked the door open and slid into the passenger seat. Drive. He chuckled, pulling away from the curb. The interior smelled like coffee and cheap air freshener. Must have been bad if you called me instead of handling it yourself. I stared out at the passing streetlights. It's not over. Liam glanced at me, his smirk fading. You got a plan? I exhaled. Yeah. And they're not gonna like it. Liam drove without asking more questions, which was why I called him. He knew when to talk and when to keep his mouth shut. The city passed by in streaks of neon and headlights, the roads slick from a late evening drizzle. Coldwater never changed, cracked sidewalks, boarded-up storefronts, the kind of place where people got tired before they got old. We hit a red light, and Liam tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. So, what's the angle? He finally asked. You just gonna knock his teeth out? Or are we talking something more creative? I watched a couple of teenagers loitering near a liquor store, hoodies up, waiting for the right drunk idiot to ask them if they wanted to make a few bucks. I'm not wasting my fists on a guy like Hudson. I want him to feel this. Liam nodded like that made sense. Gotta admit, I like where your head's at. Nothing worse than a man who thinks he's untouchable. So what's step one? I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the folder I'd put together, text logs, photos, financial reports I dug up with some old contacts. Hudson doesn't just cheat on his wife. He screws people over in more ways than one. I turned the screen toward Liam. Here's the deal, he's got a reputation as some saint, a man of the people running charities, funding community projects. But look closer, and you'll see he's laundering money through half of them. Liam let out a low whistle. So he's not just an asshole. He's an asshole with dirty hands. Exactly. I leaned back. I start pressing the right buttons, and his whole perfect world starts to crack. Liam made a left turn, heading toward the part of town where people didn't ask questions. And the wife? What's her piece in this? I clenched my jaw. Brianna had made her choice, but she wasn't my focus. Not now. She's got to live with it. That's enough. Liam snorted. Cold. I like it. He pulled up to a late-night diner, the kind where the coffee tasted like burnt rubber, and the waitress knew most customers by name. I stepped out, the air thick with the smell of grease and rain-soaked pavement. Liam followed, pushing the door open and giving the waitress a nod. "Two black, Darlene," he said, sliding into a booth by the window. I sat across from him, laying my phone on the table. "I need a favor." Liam smirked. "Thought you'd never ask. You still got that guy at Coldwater Weekly?" I asked. Liam took a sip of his coffee, wincing at the heat. "Yeah, Pete Newton. He owes me for not running that story about his DUI last year." "What do you need?" I tapped my phone. "I'm sending you a file. A story, anonymous tip. It's got enough details to make people start asking questions about Hudson's charities." Liam scrolled through the file as I sent it over. "This is good. Just vague enough to make people dig. You sure you don't want it tied back to you?" "I don't need credit," I said. "I need him squirming." Liam set the phone down. "All right, I'll get it to Pete. Should be in next week's issue." "What else?" I pulled a slip of paper from my jacket pocket. "Hudson's got a private club downtown. It's where he does his real business. I need someone inside." Liam raised an eyebrow. "You want me to plant someone? Ain't exactly easy. You know people, and I don't need much, just a set of eyes and ears. Find someone who wants to make a quick buck." Liam studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Fine, but I'm charging you extra for this one." I smirked. "Put it on my tab." Darlene came back, setting down 2 plates, eggs, bacon, toast. Liam dug in like he hadn't eaten all day. "So, how's the kid?" he asked between bites. I hesitated. Dylan hadn't returned my calls in months. Last time we spoke, he told me he was sick of how I handled things, how I never let go of grudges. "He's doing his own thing." Liam gave me a look but didn't push it. "Well, maybe when all this is over, you patch that up. If nothing else, you'll need a drinking buddy when I'm gone." I chuckled. "You planning on dying soon?" "Nah," he said, grinning. "But I figure one of us should start thinking ahead." We finished eating, paid the check, and stepped back into the cold. Liam pulled out his keys. "Give me a few days on this. You'll know when the story hits." I nodded. "Appreciate it." He climbed into the taxi, rolled down the window. "Oh, and Victor? Don't do anything stupid before I get back to you." I gave him a half smile. "No promises." The taxi pulled away, leaving me standing under the flickering streetlight. Across the road, a group of kids sat on the steps of a closed pawn shop. One of them, a wiry kid named Marcus, noticed me and nodded. I walked over. "Everything all right?" Marcus asked. He was 17, had a sharp mind but a bad habit of trusting the wrong people. "Yeah," I said, handing him a 20. "Get everyone some food. And keep your heads down." Marcus took the bill but didn't move. "You're about to start something, aren't you?" I looked at him. "Yeah." He smirked. Good. Someone's gotta clean this place up. I patted his shoulder, then turned toward my car. It was time to get to work. Hudson was too comfortable. Men like him always were. Money and reputation built a cushion around them, made them think they were untouchable. I wasn't interested in proving him wrong overnight. I wanted him to feel it coming, that slow realization that the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. Liam came through faster than expected. A week after our talk at the diner, Coldwater Weekly ran an anonymous exposé questioning the legitimacy of Hudson's charities. It wasn't an outright accusation, just a well-placed suggestion, enough to make people start looking at his donations, his board members, his financials. It wasn't long before whispers turned into real questions. That was step 1. Step 2 required someone inside Hudson's private club, the Hamilton Room. It was the kind of place that didn't have a sign, just a sleek black awning and a doorman who knew who to let in. Members were lawyers, businessmen, politicians, the type that liked to drink expensive scotch while making deals they'd never put in writing. Liam had found me a guy, a washed-up gambler named Eddie who owed too many people too much money. Eddie had landed a job in the club's back bar, serving drinks and keeping his mouth shut. That was until Liam dangled enough cash in front of him to make him listen. I met Eddie in the back alley behind the club. He was jumpy, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Man, I don't know about this," he muttered, glancing toward the door like someone might be listening. "You understand the kind of people in there? I get caught snooping, they'll bury me." I leaned against the brick wall, pulling my own cigarette from my coat. "You're already buried, Eddie. You owe money to 3 different guys who'd love to take it out on your kneecaps. I'm offering you a way out." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "What exactly do you want?" "Information. I don't need you to do anything stupid. Just listen. Hudson's got a lot of dirt. Financials, side deals, maybe more affairs. Keep your ears open, and anything useful you hear, you pass it to Liam." Eddie hesitated. "And what do I get?" "Your debts disappear." I flicked my lighter, the flame catching for a second before I let it die. "Or you can walk away and keep dodging collectors. Up to you." He sighed, dragging a hand through his thinning hair. "Fine. But if this goes south, I never met you." I smirked. "That's the spirit." The next few days I let things sit. The best way to make a man sweat is to let the pressure build. I didn't contact Brianna, didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing what was coming. But I heard things. Hudson's wife had started asking questions. Board members were suddenly too busy to return his calls. A couple of his business partners were conveniently reevaluating their relationships with him. Small cracks, but cracks spread. Maggie, the barista, passed along another observation when I stopped in for coffee. "Your wife hasn't been by lately," she said, leaning on the counter as she slid the cup toward me. "Guess her boyfriend's got other things to worry about." I took a sip. "That's so?" She smirked. "The guy's been looking stressed. Saw him here yesterday. Took a call and left looking like someone pissed in his caviar." I nodded. Good. It was time for step 3. Hudson had an image to protect. He thrived on control of his reputation, his business, his personal life. I planned to strip that away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. And the best way to do that was to force him into the light. I made a call to Liam. "Get your guy to tip off the press about Hudson's next appearance." Liam chuckled on the other end. "You really want to put on a show, huh?" "I want the world to see him for what he is." Hudson was scheduled to appear at a charity function that weekend, an event he had planned months ago, back when he still thought he had control. His wife would be there, his donors, his business partners. Perfect. I had one last stop before the event. The pawn shop near downtown was small, cluttered, the kind of place that smelled like old wood and desperation. The owner, Marty, knew me from way back. He looked up from behind the counter as I walked in, his beady eyes narrowing. "Don't tell me you're finally selling something, Victor," he said, scratching his chin. "Not today." I pulled a small envelope from my pocket, slid it across the counter. "I need something." Quietly, Marty picked up the envelope, thumbed through the bills inside. "What kind of something?" A recording device. Small. Discreet. Marty grunted, disappearing into the back. A minute later, he returned with a tiny, high-quality mic, military grade. Picks up everything. I took it, testing the weight in my hand. Perfect. Marty gave me a look. This legal? I smiled. What do you think? That night, I waited outside Hudson's private club. The Hamilton room was busy, cars pulling up, men in tailored suits stepping out with women who weren't their wives. I leaned against my car, watching, waiting. Eventually, Hudson himself appeared, stepping out of a sleek black sedan, adjusting his cufflinks like he owned the city. I made my move. He didn't notice me at first, too wrapped up in himself. But as I stepped in front of him, blocking his path, he finally looked up. His expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something close to annoyance. "Daniels," he said, smooth as ever. "What a surprise." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "Jacob." He glanced around, probably checking to see if anyone was watching. "Is there something I can help you with?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Just wanted to see the man who threw away everything for a cheap thrill." His jaw tightened. "You should watch your tone." "Or what?" I laughed. "You gonna call security? You really want to make a scene right now?" He didn't respond, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. I patted him on the shoulder, letting my fingers rest just a second too long. "Enjoy your night, Hudson." Then I walked away, leaving him standing there, jaw clenched, fists tight. Let him wonder. Let him worry. Tomorrow the real fun would begin. Hudson showed up to the charity event looking like a man trying too hard to prove he wasn't sweating. The venue was one of those upscale hotels downtown. Chandeliers glowing, waiters moving through the crowd with silver trays. The kind of place where people pretended they cared about sick kids while sipping $200 whiskey. Hudson worked the room like usual, shaking hands, flashing that polished smile, making his rounds. But there was a stiffness in his shoulders, a slight hesitation before he spoke, like he knew something was off but couldn't place it. I was already inside, slipped in early, courtesy of a forged invitation. Nothing fancy, just a name swap with some big-shot donor who wouldn't be showing. Nobody questioned a man in a dark suit who walked with purpose. From across the room, I spotted Brianna. She looked good. I'd give her that hair-done, expensive dress, the kind of polish that came easy when you were trying to act like your life wasn't unraveling. But there was tension in her jaw, the kind that didn't go away no matter how many deep breaths you took. She hadn't seen me yet. Neither had Hudson. Perfect. I took a drink from a passing waiter, positioned myself near the stage where Hudson would be giving his speech. Liam had done his part, press was here. Not the big networks, but enough local reporters to make sure the fallout had reach. And Eddie, my man inside the Hamilton room, had come through with something better than I expected. Hudson wasn't just laundering money through his charities. He was taking donations meant for the community and filtering them into private accounts, covering his losses on bad real estate deals. That was fraud. The kind of thing that would ruin him in ways an affair never could. The room hushed as the MC took the stage, a sleek-looking woman in a designer dress who rattled off scripted pleasantries. Then she welcomed Hudson. He walked up, all confidence, gripping the podium like it owed him something. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to stand before you tonight." I barely listened. I was watching Brianna. She was near the front, standing beside a few women from the hospital, nodding along to his words. Did she still believe in him? Did she still think she had traded up? The speech droned on, the usual self-congratulatory nonsense about giving back, about how much he cared. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. Then, right on cue, the first phone went off. A chime, then another. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people glanced at their screens. I knew what they were seeing. An email, sent anonymously to every major donor and board member, linking directly to a freshly leaked financial report. Numbers, transfers, timelines. The proof was undeniable. Hudson's voice faltered. He saw it happening, saw the shift in the room. People whispering, eyes narrowing, hands pulling away from pockets that used to welcome him. He cleared his throat, tried to push through. But I wasn't done yet. A voice from the crowd cut through the awkward silence. Jacob, care to comment on the missing funds? That was Pete Newton, Liam's guy at Coldwater Weekly. I hadn't told him to ask the question, but I wasn't complaining. Hudson froze. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. I'm sorry, I don't know what you're referring to, he said, his smile strained. Another reporter jumped in. It looks like over $1 million in misallocated donations. Are you saying these reports are false? Hudson's wife, who had been smiling just minutes ago, was now staring at him like she was seeing him for the first time. He looked around for help, but there was none. The donors he had spent years schmoozing were suddenly backing away like he had a disease. I stepped forward then, just close enough for him to see me. Recognition flickered in his eyes. His jaw clenched. He knew. I tipped my glass toward him in a mock toast. Hudson turned back to the microphone, tried to salvage what little dignity he had left. I think there's been some kind of mistake. These allegations are true. Brianna's voice. The whole room turned. She stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Maybe she had known something was wrong, maybe not, but she had just driven the final nail into his coffin. Hudson looked at her, his face pale. Brianna, She didn't give him the chance to finish. She just shook her head, turned on her heel, and walked out. The reporters swarmed. The questions came rapid fire. Hudson backed away, his polished facade crumbling, caught in a storm he couldn't control. I watched for a few more seconds, then left. Outside, the air was crisp, cool. The city noise hummed around me, car horns, distant music, life moving forward. I pulled out my phone, dialed. Liam picked up after the first ring. Hell of a show, Daniels. He's done, I said, lighting a cigarette. No doubt, Liam said, laughing. And Brianna? Think she figured out she picked the wrong guy. I exhaled smoke into the night. Doesn't matter. Hudson would spend the next few weeks scrambling. Damage control, PR spin, trying to claw back what he could. But the scandal wouldn't go away. It never did. Not when the right people had the right information. And Brianna? She would wake up tomorrow alone with nothing but the wreckage of the choices she made. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure people paid for what they did. And tonight, the bill had come due. A week passed. Hudson was circling the drain. His name was in every local paper, his face flashing across news segments with the words charity fraud stamped underneath. Board members were resigning. Investors were pulling out. His wife had packed her bags and moved out of their lakefront mansion. The man was drowning and no one was throwing him a rope. I didn't watch the interviews, didn't bother reading his pathetic excuses. I already knew how the story played out. He'd deny everything, claim he was being framed, try to scrape together what little power he had left. But it was over. He was finished. As for Brianna, I hadn't seen her since the event. I heard through the grapevine that she had taken some time off work. Maybe she was embarrassed. Maybe she was ashamed. Maybe she was sitting in some apartment replaying every choice she'd made, wondering how she had ended up alone. But that wasn't my concern. She was a chapter one had already closed. What mattered now was what came next. The warehouse had been empty for years, nothing but rusted beams and broken windows. But the bones were good and I had a plan. I wasn't in the business of saving lost souls, but I knew some kids who needed a place that wasn't the street, who needed someone watching their back. I had spent years tearing things down, it was time to build something. Tommy Lewis, an old buddy who worked construction, stood next to me, hands on his hips as he looked at the place. Hell of a project, Victor. You sure you don't just want to take up fishing? I smirked. Never been good at sitting still. He let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, I remember. All right, I'll call some guys. We'll get the framework solid first, then see what we need from there. We walked inside, dust swirling in the air as our boots scraped against the concrete. The ceiling had holes, the wiring was shot, but I could see it. A gym, a study room, a place where kids could get off the streets for a few hours, maybe get a meal that didn't come from a gas station. Tommy gave me a look. You really putting your own money into this? I nodded. Someone's got to. He shook his head, a small smirk on his face. You're a stubborn bastard, you know that? Yeah, I said, I've heard that before. By the time we locked up, the sun had set. I lit a cigarette leaning against my truck, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. A familiar voice cut through the quiet. Didn't think I'd find you here? I turned. Dylan stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking like he wasn't sure if he should be here. He had grown into himself over the years, taller now, sharper features, but he still had Brianna's eyes. He hadn't reached out in months. I took a drag, exhaled. You came looking, or was this an accident? He hesitated, then stepped closer. Mom called me. I kept my face unreadable. That right? Yeah, he said, shifting his weight. She sounded different. Said she screwed up. I let out a short laugh. Took her long enough to figure that out. Dylan didn't smile. She asked if I'd talk to you. I flicked ash onto the pavement. And? He hesitated. And I told her I didn't need her to tell me when to see my own father. Something settled in my chest, something I hadn't realized had been sitting there. I nodded. You want a beer? He smirked, shaking his head. Still underage. That never stopped me. He let out a breath, almost a laugh. Maybe just a coffee. I pushed off the truck, gesturing toward the diner down the street. Then let's go. We walked, neither of us in a hurry, the city stretching ahead, the past behind us where it belonged. The coffee at Darlene's diner was still terrible. Hot, burnt, strong enough to peel paint. Dylan stared at his cup like he was trying to decide if drinking it was worth the risk. I sipped mine without a second thought. Some things didn't need to be good, just strong enough to get the job done. Dylan drummed his fingers on the table, eyes flicking around the diner, probably looking for a way to start whatever conversation he had come here for. I let him stew. A man's gotta find his own words. Finally, he sighed. Mom says you didn't even yell. I glanced up. At her. He nodded. I shrugged. What's the point? He let that sit for a second. She was wrong, you know. About you. I leaned back, watching him. He looked tired, but not in the way young men usually did. Not the kind of tired that comes from late nights and bad decisions. This was the kind that settled deep, the weight of realizing things weren't as simple as you once believed. She thought you'd push us away on purpose, he said. Like you didn't care enough to try. I set my cup down. I always cared. Just never begged people to stay. Dylan chewed on that, nodding slightly. Yeah, I get that now. Outside, a couple of guys walked past, laughing, pushing each other around like kids do when they don't want to admit they care about each other. The street was still alive, bars letting out, taxis waiting for the drunk and the lost. I watched it all through the window, letting the moment settle. Dylan cleared his throat. I saw what you did to Hudson. I smirked. Not exactly subtle, was it? His lips twitched. No, but it was clean. Precise. I took another sip. That's how it should be. He hesitated. You always believed in that? Handling things outside the system. I looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't asking as a son looking for reassurance. He was asking as a man who wanted to understand. The system works for the people who built it, I said. For the rest of us, we do what we have to. Dylan nodded slowly, staring at his coffee like it might have the answers. I used to think you were just angry all the time. Now I think you just see things for what they are. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The waitress came by, topped off our cups, and left without a word. Dylan watched her go, then let out a breath. Mom asked if I'd forgive her. I raised an eyebrow. What did you say? He ran a hand through his hair. Told her I didn't know. I nodded. Fair. She's alone now, he added, like that was something I hadn't already figured out. That's on her, I said. Every choice comes with a price. He studied me for a long moment. You regret any of yours? I met his eyes. Not the ones that mattered. He absorbed that, then smirked slightly. You ever gonna tell me what's going on with that warehouse project? Maybe, I said. Depends if you actually show up to see it. He rolled his eyes but smiled, just a little. Yeah, all right. I'll come by. We sat there for a while longer, the silence comfortable, the coffee still terrible, the city still moving outside. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was something. And sometimes something was enough. The sun was low over Coldwater, throwing long shadows across the empty lot. The warehouse still looked rough, patched-up roof, fresh lumber reinforcing the structure, but it was standing, solid. Inside, the echo of hammers and drills bounced off the walls. Tommy had brought in more guys, men who knew how to build, men who didn't ask questions. They worked fast, steady. Dylan stood beside me, hands in his pockets, watching. You always wanted to run a construction site, or is this a midlife crisis thing? He asked. I smirked. Midlife crisis is when you buy a boat. This is something else. He nodded like he got it, like maybe for the first time he understood why I did what I did. Tommy walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. We're ahead of schedule. Got most of the interior framing done. Should be ready for drywall by next week. I gave him a nod. Appreciate it. He squinted at Dylan. And you are. Dylan stuck out his hand. His kid. Tommy shook it, grunted. Huh. Didn't think you existed. Dylan smirked. I get that a lot. Tommy glanced between us, then gave me a knowing look. Well, kid, if you're hanging around, grab a hammer. We don't do spectators. Dylan raised an eyebrow at me. I shrugged. You heard the man. He sighed, shaking his head, but followed Tommy inside. I leaned against my truck, lit a cigarette, let the smoke curl into the cool air. It felt good seeing things take shape. A place for the kids who didn't have one. Something useful, something real. Something that lasted. A car pulled up, sleek and black, out of place in this part of town. Brianna stepped out. I took another drag, watching her walk over. She looked different. Not worse, not better. Just different. Like someone who finally understood the weight of their own decisions. She stopped a few feet away, crossed her arms. Dylan told me about this place. I exhaled, flicked ash to the ground. Yeah? She nodded, glancing at the warehouse. It's a good thing. You always were good at building things from nothing. I didn't respond. She shifted, choosing her next words carefully. I lost everything, Victor. I met her eyes. No. You gave it away. That hit her. I saw it in the way her throat bobbed, the way she clenched her jaw. She took a breath, steadied herself. I didn't come to ask for anything. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I let that sit for a moment. Okay. Her brow furrowed, like she had expected something more. An argument, maybe? Some grand speech. I gave her nothing. She exhaled sharply. That's it? What else do you want? I don't know. She looked away. I guess I thought. I don't know. I nodded toward her car. You should go. She looked back at me, eyes searching. But there was nothing left to find. She left without another word. I watched her car disappear down the street, then turned back toward the warehouse. Dylan was inside now, sleeves rolled up, working a drill, nodding along as Tommy barked instructions. He wasn't a kid anymore. He wasn't waiting for permission. I took another slow drag, exhaled, let the moment settle. Justice had been served. The past was done. And the future? The future looked just fine.